Tonight's guest lecturer is, his name is Perry Kulper. He's an architect and an associate professor of architecture at the University of Michigan in the United States. Prior to his arrival at the University of Michigan, he was a SciArc faculty member for 16 years, and he also held visiting positions at the University of Pennsylvania and Arizona State University. His work explores the role of representation in the production of architecture and in broadening the conceptual range by which architecture contributes to our cultural imagination. It's been extensively exhibited worldwide and published in a variety of publications, including Drawing Architecture. Tonight, Perry has explained that he's going to give a lecture which will explore the generative potential of architectural drawings, the capacities of diverse design methods, and the conceptual breadth for what is spatially and culturally possible in design. Thank you. Let's welcome Perry.
It's fantastic to be here, and Matthew's worked hard. I've been here in Australia 3 days, I think, and 4 days. And the 3 schools worked quite hard to, So thank you very much to Matthew and the school. Let's say a couple of things and then get involved in the lecture. One, it's important for me to understand that first and foremost, architecture is a generous discipline and must be. Secondly, and I'll just put my cards on the table, I'm interested in developing dexterous and versatile students in terms of their abilities to work on ornamentation in a Las Vegas casino on the one hand, the next day perhaps make a film linked to parametric thinking and children's narratives, and the next day build a backyard deck and be equally comfortable in any of those rooms. So dexterity and versatility is a big thing. Right now, the key problem for me is trying to figure out the scope of architecture. What should a piece of work entail? That's not, for my money, that's not given. In architectural education, it's normally given through the program. That normally sets the scope of the work. I think that has almost nothing to do with its cultural scope. And so I'm interested in trying to figure out what's relevant to work on, what's the scope, what should a piece of work deal with, the fitness, cultural durability of work, and so on. Not that I've accomplished that at all, but I'm going to do, Matthew touched on the drawing, design methods, and conceptual breadth, so I'll sort of set that into play, those into play, and then I'll talk a little bit about some of my work, a cross-section of my work, while trying to cultivate that triad of things that I think are incredibly important. I should also say that things like design methods and conceptual breadth, in my opinion, are virtually non-existent in schools of architecture. And for better or worse, it's actually shocking to me, design methods, for example, that those aren't in play. It's unlikely that I would go to a physician and say, please take my spleen out. And the physician says, I don't know how to do that. Actually, in architectural education, I don't know anyone in the world, and not that I do it, but I'm going to expose a few methods. I don't know anyone in the world that actually foregrounds how we work and the values and etymologies of design methods. And conceptual breadth, I would push. How many students are in here? So you, given current medical standards, you could be working in the discipline, let's say, 60 years. And if we can 3D print buildings, let's say, yeah, in 50 or 60 years, printing buildings will look like child's play. Architectural education, however, is mired in a kind of 19th century model, typology, program domination, and so on. And there's almost no conceptual breadth introduced into thinking, let's say, in architectural education. So maybe the case here, I don't know the school well. But those two places I would champion or advocate in strong ways in terms of particularly the students in the room. I don't think about architecture at all, at all. It's not professional training. It's a discipline, it's a cultural discipline. And our roles, I think, are to be cultural agents and to enable the human condition to exercise its greatest potential over a lifespan, let's say. So I don't teach about professional training. That's easy. The cultural agency of architecture is considerably harder. So those just to put a few cards on the table. With some frequency, I make, let's say, templates like this that just have to do with exposing kinds of influences, people, things, phenomena. So I probably have 10 of these, and I just brought one along. And your eyes can just wander momentarily, and you can pick up on, you get a sense of some things that I've been both interested in and probably influenced by people, again, people, things, objects. The structure for the talk I mentioned. The three sort of important things for me in this talk, and then the 5 things below I'll touch on momentarily, and then I'll get to some of my work. So the naming problem. This is hugely problematic in architectural education and in the profession, because as soon as we name things, we've probably excluded 90% of what's possible. So if I ask you to design a foyer or a house, the piece of work is already 70% finished before lifting a finger, because of everything that precedes one's engagement with something like that. So one of the other things I should say about what I do and think about is I don't take anything for granted in education or as a maker of things. And this is one of the things the naming problem is one area that's allowed me to sort of pry open what I used to take for granted. If I asked you to design a bedroom, there's probably a bed, a light table, the bathroom's probably nearby. You could do that. That's not to understand at all what structures something like the bedroom, privatization of sexuality, illness, dream states, the autonomy from a world, and so on. So the naming problem is something that if you take anything away from the talk tonight, that might be one thing that check the names of things at the door next time. Language folds. Increasingly, language has become important to me relative to the ways in which I both frame my own work, think about programmatic possibilities and the ways in which I work, but also with students. There's a precision in language. If architecture and representation are imprecise, language is quite precise. So increasingly, language has become important to me, and I'll tip my hat a couple of times to how that seems to be effective for me in terms of enlarging what I do. Analogous thinking. I'll expose to you momentarily 14 design methods. Analogous thinking is one of those methods. What are analogs? This is like that, this behaves like that, this looks like that. If you think about analogous thinking, every single one of you in the room can enlarge your design capacities in terms of formal and material possibilities 100-fold in the snap of the fingers by working analogously. So, and I'm working on a high-rise. The skin of the high-rise might be like a sidewinder rattlesnake crossed with graffiti and organized like the game of Go. the envelope might be like that. Now, that seems crazy. Naomi's looking at me like, what the hell is that guy talking about? But in terms of a creative participation with the world, you can work far, far outside of your own limits, which is something, it's the only thing that I really work hard at, trying to overcome my own limits. And analogous thinking allows you to tap into anything in the world that you're aware of, and those things, phenomena, histories, operations, and so on, can become grist for the design mill. I'm not asking you to work analogously or think that way, but it's been both useful with students when appropriate, but also in terms of enlarging my own conceptual breadth. Tailored visualizations, one of the things that's particular to me, and I'll show you a handful of biopsies of drawings, is when I work, often I will make drawings that are particular to what I'm working on. So it's not that I don't respect conventions, I do, but conventions often don't allow me to work on what I need to work on. So tailored visualizations, making up kinds of representations. They can be 2, 3, 5 dimensional. Most of mine are flat. That's something that's particular to me, and I'd ask people to think about. And lastly, most work that's produced in both schools of architecture and in the profession is homogeneous in the families of ideas which belong to it. It's A, easy to teach, B, systematization, post-enlightenment thinking, totalization. Lots of things in the last 300 years in particular have produced, I think, homogeneous thinking. And in my mind, homogeneity is one of the least effective ways to produce cultural durability in work. There just aren't enough lives in homogeneous thinking. So sometimes I'm interested in heterogeneous ideas in a piece of work. Yeah, I'm not going to go through the list because it's being recorded. If anyone in the room happened to be interested, they could come back and work through why I believe conceptual breadth is necessary. I tipped my hat to that, and that's probably enough for now. So this image has to do with an interest in something like spatial ventriloquism. And then I've made about 70 unfinished or lightly finished projects, of which I'm going to show you 7 categories: materiality, fabrication, production, atmospheres, change, flux, the architectural drawings part of it, and so on. These are little ditties that allow me, it's one of the many ways in which I try to keep my imagination, my conceptual imagination alive. It's the 50 to 60 year story again, in terms of what might be necessary or possible. It's not that these are right or interesting or the only ones. They're just things that I do to imagine other possibilities. So what would happen if architecture made, erased, and remade itself? Or what about out-of-focus architecture? And so I work at many, many levels and on lots of different kinds of things, but I'm interested in trying to keep my imagination alive in terms of what might be possible, not that it's relevant or interesting, appropriate even, but things that allow me to tickle things that might have bearing. What would happen if you made an architecture that forgot its own presence? Or in the last page of these, when is the time of rendering? Where's another one that I like? Spatial ventriloquism I like quite a lot. Use literary terms analogously to produce spatial tactics. So aphorisms, synecdoches, metaphors, similes, and so on. What if that produced the construction logic for an architecture? So this is both with the work that I do, not so much the design work, but these lightly finished projects. I do things both myself and with students to try to enlarge what's conceptually possible. If people know what I do, they tend to think of me as someone who draws, and sometimes draws in slightly less than conventional ways. I don't actually care about drawing. I do. But I care about what they allow me to do. So it's not as if I have a fetish for drawings. They just allow me to do things. And there are 2 or 3 key things in a list of 6 that really matter to me. The difference between the language of representation and the language of architecture. Those are radically, radically different things. They have contingent and sometimes symbiotic relationships to one another, but they're also very, very, very different. Most professionals and most training in architecture school assumes that that architectural representation is commensurate with the language of architecture. In my mind, nothing could be further from the truth. Therefore, the architectural drawing, and when I use drawing, that's 3-dimensional pieces, constructs, temporally based things. I'm just using the drawing because it's particular to me. But normally, the techniques by which we work are strangled, again, because of the inheritances and default positions by which we operate through them. I care a lot about the bottom 2, the latent capacity of drawings. You don't want me to move around so much, do you? Yeah, because I'm nervous. Yeah. You want me to stand over here, don't you?
Yes, please.
All right, I can do that. So that I'm not so interested in what I know and trying to prove that. I'm interested in the drawing allowing me to discover what might be possible. So that then puts an emphasis on, let's say, the latent things, the things which cannot be discussed, aren't known in advance, tacit knowledge, etc. So that's an incredibly important thing for me. And then material in school and in the drawing, material is conceptual, it is not real. Gravity can go missing, and duration is malleable. None of those things are true in real space, probably, although they are entirely true in real space. But I treat those, the bottom, material, gravity, and duration, as negotiable and variable. I'm going to go through fairly quickly 9 drawing types that I've developed for myself. They're known, many of them. It has to do with the tailored visualization problem and being able to work on things more effectively in different phases of what I do. So aspectival drawings challenge the synthetic properties of perspectival drawings. They're fragments, they are assembled, maybe gaps in the drawings, gaps in the architecture. But in many cases, when I work, I don't know what everything is. And I'm not willing to try to synthesize things in a plan or a perspective or any of the synthetic modes of working too early. So when I work on hunches, certainties, hearsay. I'm making decisions from lots of different points of view. 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, Wallace Stevens' amazing poem. I make decisions from that kind of range of perspectives, and the aspectival drawings allow me to hold things at abeyance that I don't know about. Then there are things that started in 1996 called strategic plots, but there are proto-strategic plots. These drawings have to do with, this is pre-digital. I don't work digitally in any case, so it's kind of a moot point, but 20 years ago I was trying to figure out how you would plot events, things, phenomenon over and through time. So the proto-strategic plots were developed prior to the most important marks probably that I've ever made. And this is a fragment of a drawing that's called a strategic plot for an island competition, which I'll touch on a little bit in a few minutes when I get to some of my work. So to try to plot things, conceptual logics, over and through time became important to me. Then there are things called thematic drawings, in which I'm trying to visualize the key interests of a piece of work. So that rather than write them or think them, I will often build drawings that in a visual status try to begin the initial structuring for a piece of work. Then there are things called cryptic drawings. They're essentially genetic or chromosomal drawings that I make, so they're not formal or material, but they have sort of embedded or locked in them the genetic makeup of something. And then there are proto-formal drawings in which before form and before material, but beyond cryptic or glyphic drawings, things that begin to anticipate formal and material makeup, but are not there yet. Then I have relational drawings in which I isolate things that I'm trying to work on. So most architectural drawings are comprehensive, plans, sections, axonometrics, digital models, whatever. And they focus normally on the architectural or spatial production. I work on things where I need to isolate things from the synthetic knowledge that I'm trying to build. In this case, I'm working on erasure, and I'll show you a couple of larger drawing images and draw that out a little more specifically. Then these are quite familiar in architectural development, composite drawings, where you move, there are multiple languages of architectural representation happening simultaneously. So in this drawing, there are elevational things, there are sectional things, there are notational things, and there are indexical things that coexist simultaneously. There are analogous drawings, that is, visualizations that are like tendencies or traits or attributes of something that I'm trying to work on, but I don't know what they are yet, but I know what they're like. So those are the 9 that I've queued up tonight. And then this is I'm an old fart. So the drawing, the work tables sort of look like this. You have no idea what some of these things are, which I like. Like, who can tell me what the black and white striped stuff is? Anyone have any idea what that is? Do you own any of that? Can I have it? That's hard to find. Do you know who Brian Cantley and Neil Denari are? Do you have some of that?
No, I thought that you were asking what they were.
Ah, what are they?
Well, I think that you can make stripes on paper
Yes.
and make all sorts of drawings and stripes.
No question about that. Do you want a master's degree tonight? I can make that happen. That's very good. What's your name?
My name is Pascal.
Pascal, it's good to meet you, and thank you for your insight. So the drawing table looks like that sometimes. These are 14 design methods. You should emblazon these in your memories and then erase them when we finish in about an hour. These are 14 design methods which I've identified. I don't know how many there would be. There may be double or triple this number. And one can also invent their own design methods. I have students do that all the time. They're working on a set of things to do with narrative conditions, data sets, and atmospherics. And they might develop a design method which is called illustrative description that allows them to work on those problems. This may be familiar to you, or you may say, ho-hum, I don't care about design methods. A handful of key things I would say. One, sorry, now I'm moving around, aren't I? if you don't know design methods about them, where they came from, what their preferences are, how authors intersect with them, what they do well and don't do well relative to other things, how you actually use them, at least I would not feel like an architect. There's no question about that. So when we set them up in the studio, they're never the content, but we try to expose a lot of things. We get behind the screen. So we set up the etymology. Where does the method come from? What's the definition of the method? What is it? Where does it come from? What does it do well and not well? How do authors interface with it? Sequentially, collaboratively, reflectively, and blah, blah, blah. How do you work with the method? What's the sequence by which a method unfolds? Case studies and so on. Almost never do we work with a single method. We're normally combining them, and we're usually unaware of them. But normally, we have an incredibly limited working palette, methodologically, in architecture school and in the profession. And so I would advocate and champion that you consider the means by which you work. You can produce radically different work within these 14 methods. So if you said, I'm going to make a house, I'm going to make 14 houses actually, and I'm going to use each method to produce that house, you'd produce radically different work. You may not care about that, I do, because I'm not interested, I have zero interest in doing the same work from piece of work to piece of work. I have no interest in that whatsoever. So now I'm going to show you some examples quickly. Student work, it's fast work, it's done in a seminar, and I'll just work through design methods a little bit. So in this case, the brief, the students had to work with 6 1/3 alphabetic-like forms. It had to be pink and yellow, and they needed to deal with the X, Y, and Z coordination system. So I just asked them to produce formal and suggested material things so that they had to do. How do you work syntactically? When you work syntactically, you're working towards a grammar, a syntax. Normally, architects work, when they work syntactically, the work is normally formal to find a formal language. So Durand's 1791, the kind of recombination of classical pieces of architecture to produce new plan types. Maybe an early parent, Peter Eisenman's house drawings, are complete protagonists of syntactical production. Rules, done sequentially. Cut, splice, index, multiply 6 times, erase, backlog, that kind of thinking. A lot of schools of architecture, at least in the States, rely a lot on syntactical thinking. A, because it gives students a sense that they've accomplished something. B, it's easy to teach because it's logically driven. And C, it deals with systematic thinking, homogeneity, totalization, and so on. So I'm just show you, just show you six or so images for a handful of methods. I don't care whether these seem interesting to the students, whether they're meaningful, they're not architecture. We're just trying to find a discipline for how you work within a method to produce work. So they're not comprehensive, they don't take on social, political, historical consequences, and so on. Gestural translation. Imagine that 8 volunteers came down to the front of the auditorium here. We put your favorite Michael Jackson tune on, and you gesticulated wildly to the song. All the while, there are video cameras capturing all of the movement, the gestural structure. You go back into the studio, you download the video, you translate it geometrically, and you say, this is an office building. So you may say, well, that's not meaningful or interesting or relevant. That might be true, but it is a legitimate way to produce formation. So in this case, the brief, I asked the students to make a gesture and a translation, and they needed to cite it in either a LaCue, Ledoux, or Boulez section. And there are backstories for that, which don't matter right now. So these are just images of students, again, working their very short pieces of work, and they're working on gestural translation as a way to generate formal and material properties. This is a set of about a dozen plates that belong to this one. This is the easiest design method. This is probably as old as man. So appropriation happens at lots of cultural levels. I'm interested in the students being able, in this case, to increase their formal and material vocabulary by just finding things and reassembling them. So in this case, the brief had to do with giving them a site, in this case, a painted dome ceiling, and there are aircraft carrier deck, and there's a rock quarry photograph by Edward Bertinsky. So everything is appropriated and just essentially restructured. No programmatic interest. They're not architectural proposals. They have nothing to do with that. Again, they just have to do with understanding how a method operates and enlarging, in most cases, the students' formal and material vocabularies. Why am I interested in increasing their formal and material vocabularies? Because generally students and professionals are constipated. They don't have any idea how to make diverse forms, and that would include me. B, when we work in different situations, I would argue that the responses might need to be different, and therefore, if you don't feel confident with an expanded formal and material range, let's say you were interested in that as let's say spatially or architecturally or as an ambition, if you don't have confidence that you can make radically different kinds of forms, it's unlikely that you can act differently in different situations. So this exercise has to do with digital form finding, which is linked to parametric modeling as a design method. And the brief was quite simple. I asked the students to make a collection of objects that dealt with the surface. So I'll just show you again a handful of images in which the students are trying to work through that particular design method. These are graduate students, either in their next to last year or their last year. So now the boring part. I'm going to work through some of my work chronologically, roughly, sort of cross-section through some things that I've done. And I'll try not to describe what I've done, but try to expose some things that matter to me, or at least reflectively or insightfully as I work. So I worked for Peter Eisenman and Jack Robertson. I worked for Robert Stern, and I worked with Denise Scott Brown and Bob Venturi when I finished my graduate work at Columbia. I left the office in Philadelphia, Denise and Bob's office, and moved to Los Angeles, and I had 3 commissions almost immediately. One for a small guest house in Montecito. I was invited to an international competition for a house in, at that time, West Germany. That's a plan. I developed 5 proposals in 5 weeks, and I spent the last week working on the final proposal here, which is that. And I had a small desert house, second house for clients in one of Southern California's deserts. I'm very proud of these plans. I made them. People think that I'm actually a licensed architect. This will be hard to believe probably when we get a little further into this. I'm going to stop for a moment here. This is something that interests me as well. I drew this plan 34 times. I constructed it at 1/4 inch equals a foot before I got the plan that I wanted. What's more interesting to me than that plan is to build all 34 of those plans simultaneously. So I'm going to do that project because every mark I made had value in all 34 iterations. And so I'm interested in retaining all of the valuable marks. So they're just normal drawings. I made tons of models and drawings, and I made $800 and probably worked 600 hours on it. And it didn't get built. Transverse section, sort of normal stuff. There's a steel floor that was meant to come to the site a year before anything else arrived, and then various technologies and interventions were meant to happen, from burrowing animals to graffiti and so on. And then the second piece that was meant to be built was there's a fallout-like kitchen. It's a cedar box which can sort of fold itself up and you can survive in a hermetic environment. And then ultimately, this is the inside of the kitchen. The bathroom. Eventually the shell of the house would arrive, and this is the shell of the house. So the interest had to do with contextual responses and client wishes and vastness and isolation and enigmatic objects, the sublime, things which seem to be relevant in the space of the desert. I really disliked that version, so I made another version of that house after the project died. And these are drawings for the second version of that desert house. These are some of the images that were produced, and they were the first time in which I began to break the architectural drawing open through these aspectival drawings. At the same time, Amy was doing a PhD at Cambridge in England, and we lived in a house that was 11 feet wide and about 40 feet long, and I essentially designed a room. And I'll just describe the room. I won't get involved in the content or the ideas. There's a leather floor. There's a double aquarium. There's a miniature version of St. Paul's Cathedral in the aquarium. There's a steel cactus wall, and there are fire elements in it. There are encrypted kind of alphabetic-like marks. There's a little biplane. There's a chrome balloon which floats in the space. The leather floor is vented and it drops down into a rubber basement. And then there are just things like kitchen cabinets and so on. Doesn't matter the content. The point I want to make, it doesn't matter what the content is. And there's a chrome blue object that sits adjacent to the entrance when you turn up at this place. So just straight up views. There's the double aquarium, and it's got some alphabetic-like parts in it. And this is the second aquarium right here, and so on. As a result of making this work, I realized a handful of things. A, I wasn't very good. B, and I started teaching at SciArc at this time. So I'm around Tom Main, Eric Moss, Mike Rotundi, Neil Denari, Coy Howard, Marianne Ray, and Robert Magorian, who may or may none of those people may be familiar to you, Morphosis and so on. I realized I wasn't very good. I didn't have very much to say, and all the work was the same. You can imagine for a young person at that time, I was distraught. That was a problem. I wasn't going to do this for 60 years. So I then got onto this open competition for the island just off the coast of New York called David's Island. And I began to both think about the temporality of drawing, or at least illustrating the temporality, but I also began to think about the drawing allowing me to do other kinds of things. So there was no program, for example. The drawing allowed me to begin to think about programmatic possibilities. I had a bunch of ideas. The ideas ranged from that the work would be about, from things to do with nautical cartography, panoptic and panoramic vision, the role of islands culturally, military suppressions and regimes of the military occupation of the island, and so on. So the drawing became an operative vehicle for me to think through ideas, to begin to figure out how to structure those ideas, how they might come about through, let's say, architectural and landscape elements. The naming problem came into play. So I have things like landings for mythical sea travelers with polyp labs that parasitically comb the landings for mythical sea travelers, taking data in kelp harvesting beds. There's an axis of mutiny. There's a multiplied officers' headquarters. There are camouflagic surfaces where children sail black sailboats in the white stripes, and mussels are raised in the black stripes. There are labyrinths of emptiness that accelerate and decelerate wind. There are buildings which are flooded, very particular buildings which are coated and flooded, and so on. So the drawing became a fairly fertile place for me to begin to try to figure out how to work on things that I knew, and then to discover what might be worked on. So this is just a technical drawing of the architectural elements. And there are things like steel walls, all these elements, so that when you stand at that crosshair, they produce a perfect horizon and occlude all distant land formations. There are bird colony lines that afford migrational birds to participate in the site in particular ways. There's a polished metamorphic rock garden where there are 15 objects based on the 15 rocks in the garden at Rio Angi, which is particular to the work. But those 15 objects are linked to 15 sensors in 15 different oceanic conditions. The sensors boot information back to the objects, and the objects polish an existing rock condition. There's a landing vessel, and so on. Not too long after that, my father died while I was working on that competition, so needless to say, my efforts turned elsewhere, so I didn't submit that competition. I did then another competition, which I also didn't submit. I gave up on competitions after this. It was a competition for a museum. Had a program, 60,000 square feet, all of the requisite parts of a museum, which made sense to me and one to care for. And I began to, again, think through the architectural drawing about how I might discuss things which I thought were important. So the thematic drawings essentially make visual, they're a form of visual thinking about the key ideas for the piece of work. So I was interested, for example, in the etymology of the museum, the 9 Greek muses. I was interested in how culturally we curate collections. I was interested in the structure of vision relative to objects and movement in gallery museum settings. I was interested in scientific, historic, and aesthetic understandings of objects, taxonomies, and so on. So this is simply a way to visualize some of the key interests of the work. Then I mentioned also the cryptic drawings. So these are details. The next 2 images are details of drawings which are not architectural or material, but have organizational, spatial, formal implications, but are not that yet. So these are details of those drawings. So the drawings are made, sometimes people are curious. Like the David's Island drawing is made of about 6 layers. There are animal x-rays, the foil, drawn parts, press type. Pascal, do you know what press type is? Okay, I'm gonna tell you. You know what translucent paper is? You can kind of see through it. There are letters on there that are black. And you take like a pencil and you rub those off onto another piece of paper. So I do that sometimes. So the drawings are made, some they're drawn, there are things rubbed on there, there are found imagery and so on. In the museum, as it developed, the 9 Greek muses and their potential influence became important to me. And eventually there's an alabaster surface, no, it doesn't matter why that surface is there. It belongs to the museum. And there are 9 drawing instruments that are enhanced by and articulated by the characteristics of the 9 Greek muses. Those drawing instruments do things to the alabaster. The alabaster dust falls into a crypt, and the crypt moves according to data that's spliced into the crypt that has to do with the number of people on and near the site. So this is a protoformal drawing. It's an image of a drawing, it's not a drawing, of that surface. Then there are things like protoformal drawings, which the last one was, but wasn't quite as formal as this one. So this is a kind of section through the primary architecture. And because of my interest in the program logics, I expanded. There are plenty of other kinds of programmatic elements to make the museum more culturally accessible, audience rates increased, and so on. So there are things like harvesting surfaces. There's an archive that you can't go into, and there aren't actually objects in it. There are gallery pieces that sort of modeled pink bits. There's a theater for the muses. There are sort of muse-inspired objects, these sort of bits. There are 2 nocturnal, sort of enigmatic objects that belong to it, and so on. So at a former student, we made a first pass, a kind of, let's say, chipboard model. This is not design, to try to visualize the museum. So there's a rocaille garden that you don't get into, this gradated bit here. This is a block in Fresno, California that's about 400 feet. So there's a global gallery, and these have to do with the time zones around the world. So there are plant types of the orange family that belong to the surface. There are 2 robots that care for that surface, manicure it. There are red roses, sort of calligraphic marks. This is fescue, long grasses. These are cattle. This is an archive. This is the other archive. We're seeing small parts of that archive that have objects that don't exist. There are, do you know what cherry pickers are? Is that a thing here? Yeah. So they're cherry picker-like things that allow the public to sort of hover over this space. There are a number of cherry pickers. There's a little funny motel. This is the main architecture. That's a stand-in. This is all stand-in. This is a stand-in for admin. And then there are 3 sets of Greek muse-inspired things. There's an urban set. They move around the city. There's the first pass at the Alabaster Archive, so that there are 9 that belong to that, and there are 9 that belong to the interior of that. So these are, again, just super, super quick. I wouldn't call it design. By no stretch of anyone's imagination would this be design. Tractors square dance. There are beauty pageants for farm animals staged on the surface here. It's an agricultural sort of territory with migration of farm workers and so on. So, and then there's some more recent drawings where I'm trying to work out. This is the big building. I'm trying to work it out, trying to begin to design it rather than just sort of image an impression of it. In this work, I'm interested in trying to eliminate all kinds of things which orient us domestically. So in a house, to be simple, I'm interested in trying to erase furniture, equipment, thresholds, practices, and so on, and then trying to empty that out, but retain attributes of that spatial realm, and then reboot it with a pair of what I call reflexive objects, which are the pink bits here, or the stripy bits here. But these are just relational drawings in which I'm only working on erasure, censorship, bleaching out, and recoding. They're not plans or sections or elevations or anything like that. I'm just trying to isolate the problem of erasure. So there are a whole set of marks that are stand-ins for pianos, wall outlets, thresholds, a whole set of marks that are made in the drawing. And then the marks are systematically, it's hard to see in the image. There are probably 6 layers to the drawing right here. So they're systematically erased, recoded. So I'm just trying to work that problem to get some insight about what then the house might eventually, part of what the house might want to care for or deal with. So these drawings it's probably a 60-hour drawing. The David's Island drawing's probably 125 just to do it. Invited to the Prague Biennale the year our daughter was born, 2005. And I was asked to deal with architecture as a transient phenomenon, period. So, okay, I could do that, maybe. So without going into the trials and tribulations, we worked 10 intensive days on a drawing which is 15 feet long, which I'll show you in a moment, an image of the background. And I was interested fundamentally, I said that instinct and desire have been eradicated from our experiences for a number of reasons. In this business of transient phenomenon, architecture dealing with that, instinct and desire became important, as did animality and bestiality as a way to recover instinct and desire to work on the problems of architecture as a transient phenomena. So I developed the Metaspheric Zoo, a thematic drawing, let's say. And Metaspheric Zoo is a cross between metaphor and atmosphere. And I developed 6 species for the zoo: cloned, extinct, unborn, etc. And then there are 3 programmatic elements. There's a roving taxidermy, a botanic surfacing, not a botanic surfacing, I know better than that, botanic surfacing, and a vessel for obsolete atmospheres. So the drawing is about 15 feet long. It was made of about 45 pieces. It's all mounted and put together like a puzzle, and then there are drawn parts, gold leaf parts, there are fabric parts in it. So this is just the base for the drawing. And these are just details, and it doesn't matter. It make no sense to you anyway. Why would I'm making no sense at all here, so this wouldn't matter in its meaning anyway. So I'll just show you a few. It's serious. It's sort of heavy work for me. And 2 former students, great students. Both of them teach now. So the work was getting really hard for me. I was thinking, wow, I'm going to last about another 1.5 years here. So I decided to make a really simple piece of work, or I started simply. And it's called the Fast Twitch House. And I made 3 versions of it. And every piece of work has yellow tablets. There's sketchbook-like things. And in this case, there are about 60 of these. Research, formal and material possibilities, quotations, hunches about things, and so on. The David's Island project has about 80 for that. And the museum has about 120 of these, and so on. But I made 3 versions. I didn't develop versions 2 and 3, and I'm only going to show you little tiny biopsies of the plans for those houses. So this is house number 2. And that's house number 3. And these interest me considerably more than the one that I developed. So what I said to myself is I said, wow, this work, the ideas are really, really hard. I've got 10, 15 key ideas that are really difficult things to deal with, and I don't have any skills to do it. So I said, what would happen if you dealt just with ground, sky, and horizon? That's it. So I started a series of drawings. This is the first one in which I was just starting to explore, the possibility for a desert house, dealing with that limited set of issues. And of course, I couldn't help myself. And all of a sudden, hybrid archetypes and bent vision, the sublime, lots of isolation, lots of things started to come into play. But the idea for the house is that there are a series of landscape milling machines. You have milling machines here? Yeah. So in this project, there are landscape milling machines, and they're milling the desert. They're milling the desert surface. And in this case, they're going to mill a series of garden surfaces for this house that have kind of embedded cryptic languages in them. And then there are there are 3 key objects where you live and eat and sleep and defecate. And then there is a kind of an entourage of other things, and I'll just show you those momentarily. So there's a series of drawings that were made. The drawings, 24 inches by 36 inches often. Again, layers, found things, Pascal, the black and white stripes again. All right? You see them?
They were made by those, those things with the stripes.
That's right.
The hole.
Yep, that's exactly right. Yep. You'll get another PhD tonight. So the house, I'm just going to, again, I'm not going to go into how it's structured, how the ideas are structured. I'm just going to describe to you the pieces. So these are the milled surfaces. There are lots, they're all seen as gardens, and they all have a kind of a cryptic, some other time frame language inscribed or milled onto them. So this is a pink dust garden. There's a caretaker for that garden. This is where you sleep. This is where you live. The trouble is, where you live is filled with logs, and it's made of steel. And the steel's calibrated so that at 100 years, the steel dematerializes and leaves a pile of logs on the site. You actually live in a pair of baskets, and you can see one of them right there. So you live there. You got a garden there. This thing moves back and forth. It's got an open bottom, and it moves back and forth over the pink dust garden when no one's there. You eat in that sort of lozenge bit. There's a labyrinth, and it has a red object in it that makes noise, but you never see the object. You can't, it's impossible to see. There's a cast bronze biplane, the orange tipped bit. There are milled and real cactus. There's some there, there's some in the cactus wall, and there's some on that lozenge. There's a chromed billiard ball. There's an object that periodically comes out of that lozenge bit. And then the most important bit, so there are 3 chromed shadows. And each of the big objects, I'll show you a couple of images where they're a little clearer. Each of the big objects have a chromed shadow. And then they have, of course, the sun turns up once in a while in the desert and produces other shadows. So this is a view of the house. So this is the one that's filled with logs. You get up, there's a stair inside of the thing that looks like it's filled with bullet holes. And you live in those 2 baskets on the outside. And this is the one you sleep in. There are 2 vessels in there that blah, blah, blah. This is where you eat. And there's a storage sack, a rubber storage sack underneath this where you can put stuff. So these are really early. Again, this is not design. These are just first passes. is you sleep in these two things, and they move up and down. There's a stair that's 3 inches wide at the end, goes to nowhere. There's a bathroom piece, sort of, right here. So there's the billiard ball. It's the orb. When you get lost, you just pay attention to that. When you get lost in the desert. This is the space you eat in. They're the chrome shadows. Picking up the reflection of this object. Right now we're trying to figure out how to etch in the chrome shadows architectural fragments that will never come to the site and have never been here. And those will be complemented by the real reflections of those buildings and so on. And just one last image for the project. Though I forgot to mention it, you're looking down the face of the living space. And on the side of that object is a miniature version of the proposal. And there's a mechanical hawk that belongs to that part. And there you see the chrome shadow looking out there. So we do an amazing thing. Dean Monica Ponce de Leon introduced research through making, where I teach 5 faculty members and their collaborators or not can get up to $20,000 a year to do work. So I applied for these once, the first year, and got one of those. And I spent $4,000 of $20,000 because I couldn't figure out how to. I normally have about 12 or 15 different things that I'm doing. And anyway, we worked on a problem called spatial blooms, and I was interested in trying to rethink temporalities in architecture. So I was interested in taking, the proposal is simple, yeah. Landscape organizations, the meander, the picturesque, axiality, and so on. Landscape elements, berms, dikes, revetments, ponds, fences, and so on. Sort of crossing those, and then thirdly, crossing those 2 bits with what I call landscape biologies. Temporally active things, maintenance logics, insect infestations, seasonal shifts, and so on. We didn't get any of that. That's nowhere present here. I would say I got to about 8% or 8 to 12% of what I intended to do, we got to, although we made about 600 images. So this piece of work still interests me. It's the only one so far that I've showed you that I think's good. So we began to work on how, in this case, you might begin to bloom allegories in Il Gesù, the beautiful painted ceiling dome of the church in Rome. And then there were a whole series of things that we made to try to explore the crossing of landscape organizations and landscape elements. You know, just run through. Again, I'm not going to try to expose what I think is being discussed and not being discussed. We'd be here until Christmas time. Some of the analogous drawings began to emerge to try to visualize likenesses of the landscape elements and the landscape organizational structures. Some programmatic elements began to emerge, so there are things called fabric predators. And there are zipper blooms that move between kind of notational landscapes, synthetic landscapes, and real landscapes. So a series of visualizations to work on that a bit. This is an iteration of part of the zipper bloom problem. And then there were some drawings that were more synthetic that tried to begin to gather up some of the things that had been worked on. So this is the artificial, natural, synthetic landscape bit zipper blooms, a test tube berm in which there are miniature ecologies from different parts of the world that the fabric predators muck around with and so on. And then just a really quick and not even schematic, just a kind of sketch about the test tube berm and the zipper blooms. Australia, had to put this one in. So I was asked with 24 other architects and artists around the world to produce 2 pages in a book that dealt with the theme of documenting urbanism. I was invited by my dear friend Gretchen Wilkins, who teaches at RMIT. So I developed what I called alchemic urbanism. And alchemic urbanism has to do with harvesting all kinds of surpluses in the city. So surplus energy, surplus light, surplus data. And I made 2 pages for the book, a kind of gold leaf drawing. We each had 2 weeks. And it was sort of exquisite corpse. We closed the book up and put it in a DHL envelope and shipped it off to France, where the next person was, and the next person was in Pittsburgh or whatever. So I do all kinds of things like that. Super, very, very grateful to Gretchen for the invitation. And then I've worked on a series of things called Z objects, which look for abandoned conditions in the city and sort of make some noise there. I've got a whole series of vertical surfaces, which I'm trying to, work on the envelopes for buildings. So in this case, I'm cherry picking my own work. The David's Island project is part of the discussion. So I was interested in what an architectural surface might be. And this one's inspired by M.C. Escher, of course. There's one in the works that's inspired by the Chinese landscape paintings, recent ones, recent-ish ones by Roy Lichtenstein. There's one that's a series of games that produce an architectural surface and so on. And again, we get lucky to get invited to do things. So I was invited to make the first cover for there's an online journal called Edge Condition, which is worth looking at. A friend of mine, Jim Barton, asked me to make the cover image, so I got a drawing sort of 60% complete. She said, "It's due, man." I said, She said, "It looks good." Okay. So this one, I've developed 3 cloud types. It's called Cloud Veil. And I'm trying to occlude my own work in the drawing, so it's half there. And then my friend Nat Shard and I were lucky enough to win Pamphlet Architecture 34. And we were interested in contingent architecture, let's say, architecture which doesn't predict how we behave, but that might offer multiple ways to participate with it. So we made one piece of work that's specific to that set of interests. We're working on a new book now with Routledge. We're working on 2 new pieces of work for that together, and an exhibition in London. So I made a series of drawings to try to, in this case, what would a spatial realm begin to be comprised of, where you could then work on indeterminacies. So I made handful of drawings, which these are a couple, and then I made some drawings which are related to the drawing instruments which Nat's been working on for a while, and that would allow us then to begin to just have pleasurable conversations, really, and to work on some things. We share lots of interests. We don't do work at all that is at all alike. But we're trying to develop a way to practice where we can mostly just enjoy the pleasures of conversation, Skypes. He lives in England and I live in the United States, so he used to live in Winnipeg, so I don't see him very often. But anyway, we developed these drawing instruments that have 3 primary components, or 4, let's say. So there's an infrastructure, each one, that's my instrument, that's the backside of that. So they have a kind of a chassis, they have a dome, each one of them, and there's a kind of narrative world that exists in the dome. They have a drawn surface, and they have an object right in the middle of Nat's drawn surface that interrupts the paint flow. So there are 2 catapult-like things that will launch paint at the other one. It has to do with our interest in perspectival constructions and the viewer and indeterminacy and ways in which we control or not, vision. So there's lots of interest embedded in these things. This is an object that interrupts the paint flow in Nat's. So it's quite nice. It was fun. We made the work fairly quickly. And it's allowed us to now go on, and we're just working on other kinds of things. So related to that is a piece of work also linked to contingency that I just sort of started working on. So I'm working on the photographs, the National Geographic photographs of the Titanic, the sunken ship. And right now I'm just trying to autopsy. I'm trying to do a kind of scrutiny of those images, and it's related to a big surface that sits on the ocean surface and travels multiple oceans, produces artificial weather conditions, and there are peculiar objects on it and so on that have to do with sort of a memory theater device for the dead, the sort of Titanic problem. Then I do things like I haven't made them in 10 years. I haven't done any work actually in 10 years, but I make landscape drawings. There are 750 of them. Just to give you a sense, that's 18 inches, 24, 9, 12. They're always taped, same place, 2 layers of white trace. I always date and put the location where they were made. And I work on them in series. I made them one a day. I was teaching at Penn, one of Matthew's places. And I made one a day. I would get up at 5:30, I would shower, I would eat breakfast, and I would make a drawing by 7. And I just stacked them up. And I would work, in this case, I was looking at calligraphy and Chinese landscape painting. In this case, I was interested in fungal landscapes. I had some cadmium red acrylic on the work table and said, I wonder if I could make a landscape or landscapes out of that material. So the smallest set is 4. The largest set is 35. I don't throw any away. I don't make judgments about them. I just enjoy the pleasure of working on them. But again, I'm up to too many things, and it's hard to just haven't made them. I have 2 sets in mind. I don't draw them or sketch them. And I make them. That probably took an hour to make. That probably took 45 minutes to make. That probably took 45 minutes to make. So they're sort of more between half hour and 2 hours. Monochromatic landscapes, what would that be? And then I'm almost finished. A year ago, I got invited to design a birdhouse. 30 architects from the world were invited, and I got lucky to be one of them. So this involves a larger piece of work. I'm going to make 13 birdhouses that try to construct my practice, my interest rhetorically, positionally, at a level of design. I'm going to try to make 13 birdhouses that are very different. So I'll show you some images from the first and second one. So we made a series of inspirational images that were linked to a set of ideas which had to do with natural and artificial inversions, that had to do with putting birds in the dominant position over humans, that looked at kind of metaphorical relationships to the ways in which humans populate the landscape, and the birds might rethink it through their own population of it, and so on. So we made a series of, well, we made 13 birdhouse images, and I'm showing you some of the images from the first house. And then we made just an object. It's a birdhouse, in case you didn't recognize it. So there's a bird landing strip. Of course there would be. Wouldn't there be? And they need to turn up, right? And be welcome. There's a deep taxonomic bird, which is that one is probably the most important piece. There's a garden. There's a bird rug, the black bit. There's a water table, that white and yellow bit. There are 3 hedges, the slightly bent bits. One of the hedges doubles as perch storage. There are 3 clouds, the elliptical bits, that one, and that one, and that one has a windsock house and the name of the hotel, the Flights of Fancy Bird Hotel. And there are 2 optical devices. They're the black bits, and there are 5 perches. We just made it. It's 3D printed and milled, and then it's painted. What do you call it? Auto body painter painted parts of it. Now there are feathers, and there's a nest that switches out with this. So there's a perch below, and the other 5 perches. Those perches are diving boards that belong to a body of water that's, they're just fun. What did we do? We designed it in about a week. We gave up 80% of the ideas because we couldn't figure out how to build them. And then we took 2 weeks to build it, to make the thing. So, anyway, just some details, but it's so fun. There's the deep taxonomic bird. It plays quite a substantial role in the narrative fabric of the piece of work. And then we made a bunch of images. We imagined that the birdhouse would go to lots of different places. And in this case, it's going to the eye of a flamingo. And it gets situated relative to the eye of the flamingo. And it also it floats over airport runways and in natural history museums and so on. And then the last thing I'll show you is a few images from one that's just barely started, a second version. It's the Floating Bird Motel. And a lot of the pieces are simply appropriated from the early one because we needed to get things in play, and I don't have any digital skills, so I'll just describe again what this one is. So there's now a garden bird landing surface. There are bird alphabet, these are not that, but they're bird alphabet like dancing hedges. There is a stuffed technology garden. It has upholstered bird perches. It's got a rocket, a satellite, a dirigible, and so on up there. There's a water table in a feeding condition. And then below, in the hull, there are now windsock pieces. I'll show you a little sketch drawing in a minute. There's a bird ballroom inside of it. There's a painted dome ceiling. There are propellers. And there's a retractable circus in which there are surveillance optical devices embedded in the retractable circus that can be drawn up into that thing there. So it's super, super, super early. stand-ins, really. So these are the windsock houses. The bird ballroom is just starting to emerge. There are berry clouds that belong to, there's dioramic wallpaper, the sort of greenish bit, just notated right now. Bird alphabet, topiary bits on the top. There's a kind of translucent sail piece. Got it. So just super, super early days. And yeah, bit of a model. And I'm going to show you one last image. Is it still Friday, do you think? Pascal, do you think it's still Friday? Or do you think it might be Saturday or Sunday by now, given the length of me talking?
I think it's still Friday.
Still Friday, okay. Do you feel pretty tired?
Not really.
Okay.
We're talking about interesting things.
Okay. I'm glad you came, by the way. I'm glad everybody came. And just one last image. So these are stand-ins from the earlier birdhouse for the, these will eventually become bird alphabet dancing hedges, and they move on these tracks. These are just, there's some jets set in here, but this will be the stuffed technology garden. And it's basically a sort of trophy room for birds. So, but it's got a long way to go. And that, Pascal, you'll be happy to know, that's the last thing I'm gonna show, and I'm not gonna say anything else.
Well, that's sad.
That's that, yes, sir. Okay, thank you all for coming, I really appreciate it. Sure. Does anyone have a question? Like an easy one. Oh, Pascal. Oh, I got my best friend. I came to Australia to meet you, Pascal. Actually, I've come a long way to meet you.
I wondered if the birdhouse
Yes.
could float in the air or just stood.
No, it's meant to float in the air.
Oh.
They're meant to be, this last one, there are going to be a lot of them. And they're going to be in different places in the world. One of them probably will be in a children's story. So we'll take the birdhouse into a book. There might be a couple in this room eventually. So there'll be a lot of them. And these float, they float. They travel, that's what the propellers are. Help them, you know what a propeller is?
Yeah,
Yeah.
push it forward.
Yep. So that's what the propellers are for, so they can move around the world. That's a very good question, sir. Who else has a question? Yes, ma'am.
I noticed when you were talking about a lot of your first passes, you were quite particular in mentioning that they weren't designed, they were just
Yeah.
first passes. But as far as architecture and your vision for the profession, do you have any notions for how those first passes might be developed into architectural design?
Sure, you need to, what's your name?
Daniela.
Daniela, that's a nice question. So I make a fair number of mediational drawings. They're not architecture and they're not nothing. Well, they might be nothing. That's for you to judge. Those, for me, those drawings, I showed you 6, 8, 10 of them. They hold, for me, they're cosmologies. There's quite a lot in them. For me, I don't know whether anyone else thinks that. So that when I ask someone to I don't have digital skills, and if I did, I wouldn't use them like probably anyone else gives them. When I ask someone to, let's just try to visualize this, there's a kind of crisis of reduction. So that all the latent things, the secondary and tertiary relational assemblies that are going on, get ripped out of the equation because of the certainty of the digital model. It only knows its figuration qualities. So that's the first landing to answer the question. The second one goes back to the 13 ways of looking at a blackbird. So that I would say at the moment, pretty much everything probably has two ways of looking at the work. And what it means for me is that the other 11 ways will require that the work transforms itself, because they are really very, very different objectives and ways to assess, understand, to discover the work. So they simply haven't gone through any paces. But what I would not do is simply develop them. Virtually everyone in the world develops work along a relatively linear trajectory. Even if they're making variations, it moves sort of that way. Transformation, which is probably the least taught thing in architectural education, is to change the form, and the nature of the questions also would be reformed significantly. So none of the work has undergone the 11 other points of view, much less any kind of transformational capacities. Also, they've lost in the translation, because the techniques are not right for the nature of the work. In the digital transcription, they've lost, lots of stuff got dropped off the back of the train. Yes, sir?
I wondered, did you yet decide were the birdhouses self-driving or were they still steered by human?
No, the humans wouldn't have anything to do with it. The birds would drive. The birds would drive. It's for the birds.
Oh.
Does that make sense? You think they wouldn't have licenses, no problem. Like a flamingo could drive it, or a cardinal could, or a bunch of them could drive
Do
it.
you mean like, because I saw something that there was a car,
Yeah.
and there was a fish
Ah.
side, and the side that the fish went, the side the car went.
Yeah, it's like that.
And so it's
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah, it's more like that.
Alright.
Yes, please, in the back. No, come.
Why did you title the talk Strange Attractors?
I didn't talk about that, did I?
You know.
So fundamentally, one of the key things that I'm interested in is the possibility, and this comes from surrealism, that multiple worlds could coexist, the curiosity cabinet, even the internet, so that the strange attractors is linked to possible, what I call relational assemblies, where quite strange things might be attracted, repelled, be indifferent to one another. And I'm just interested in the possibility that some work or some things might have to do with things that couldn't possibly coexist. It's a heterogeneous idea. So the strange attractors has to do with they're estranged from each other, but there's also the paradoxical condition that they're attracted to one another at the same time. There's a tensional play then between attraction and repulsion, estrangement and seduction. That's a nice question. Yes, please.
Yeah, but if you were asked to design for some accommodation on the moon,
On the moon.
or drawings be?
Sorry, I didn't.
How would your drawings, for accommodation on the moon scheme?
The question. Can you hear the question? If I were asked to design something on the moon, what would the drawings be like?
I think
I don't know the answer to that. I'd have to figure. Yeah, I don't know. I'd start to work on it. Start to put some crumbs or some evidence in play, and then I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know what they would be like. In fact, I'm so tired of drawings. All the work seems the same. There's a set of aesthetic things and styles of thinking that are too consistent right now. So if I do any work, which I haven't really in 10 years, the first thing to do is to get rid of the history. So I don't know, I'm thinking right now of three-dimensional constructs. Whether I work on the moon proposal in that way or not, I don't know. What's your name?
Phil,
Phil? So I have to fly back to Los Angeles tomorrow, and I promise you I'll be working on that question that you just asked me. Maybe 1 a.m. tonight I might be doing that as well as Pascal's question. Not the, the strange attractor. Who else has something I can work on? I don't require a lot of sleep. Other questions? You can ask me anything. Probably don't have an answer. Yes, please.
How does your work relate to work that you have your students do?
Nothing like it.
Contribute?
Nothing like it.
Okay. I was gonna say
No, it is.
contribute
No.
to the diversity, like the students' ability to do diverse work, because you said it's really important for them to be able to be comfortable
Yeah.
either designing an ornament or
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
designing an event.
Or making a manifesto. I mean, you can do all those things in the studio with me.
Right, right. I guess how does this work that your students do, how does that contribute to their ability to do the diversity?
Yeah, good question. Your name is?
John.
John, thanks for that question. So I try to teach in 2 key ways, structurally and specifically. When you try to teach structurally, you transcend the specificity of the material that you're working on. So it means that they have transference skills. They can take them to other places. They don't need to be hunkered down in the specifics of a set of ideas or a formal and material investigation. And then we always work through very, very specific things to work on the structural properties, that the principles, the things that they can put in the sack. So that's part of it. Second part of it is, in thesis in particular, I don't care what they work on. I don't care. I care how they work on it. Of course I care how they work on it, what they work on. And when I work with the students, I build up a lot with them relative to what they're accustomed to. So we will talk about the history of architectural education. We will talk about the roles the various constituencies in architectural education play: curriculum, reviews, language, studio, history, theory, and we'll build that up. I'll build up with them. I have 8 different studio types in terms of the way studios are organized. And we talk about the values and lifestyles that are attached to them and so on. We work through the methods and representational techniques. So I try to build out a platform by which they understand that many of the questions they'll be asked and that they will ask can be located, history of ideas and so on. So we build all that. I don't assume they know that. And when they work with me, they don't get stuck with me. Well, probably do. They choose to work with me, so they already know, because I'm an old, what I said before, I'm pretty old. So I've been around a while, so they know some things. But what we do is try to set up a structure for the approach. But I don't want them, I have no interest in them being me. I have 0 interest in that. And we talk a lot about them producing unique work. But they're not looking for their own style. We don't talk about things like that. They don't problem solve. I take lots of things out of play. But mostly it's a style of thinking, how to structure an approach, how to set up a set of questions, how to set up the means by which you can engage those questions and problematize them, work on them, phases of things, the mechanics of engagement of the variables, so we work a lot on that kind of stuff. And of course we work on their work, but their work doesn't look anything like mine. Remember the early slides of just the method things in a seminar? Their work would be kind of that different from mine. That's not studio work that I showed you, the student work. Anyone else have an easy question? Pascal,
question?
is it still Friday?
Yeah.
All right.
If it was, if it was tomorrow, then it would be sunny. Well, it depends if it was.
Would you like to run the school, sir? If it was tomorrow, it would be Sunday. That's the studio brief. That's what I'm going to do, thesis. That's the title of my thesis. I have to teach when I go back.
Quick question.
Yes,
How
ma'am.
do you usually begin to approach something so abstractly? Like, do you usually get inspired by your first?
How do I start work?
Yeah, how do you start? What's your first point of?
In really highly varied ways. When I work, I ask questions from a cultural point of view, a discipline-specific point of view, an institutional point of view, a situational point of view, and a personal point of view. So when I start a piece of work, I normally try to figure out what I want to say within those mediums in a piece of work. All work starts differently. This is key. It doesn't matter how you start. It does not matter how you start. If you understand transformation and the 13 ways of looking at a blackbird, it doesn't matter how you start. That should make you feel good. In my opinion, it doesn't matter how you start. It matters what you discover and how you construct the questions and so on. Yeah, you can literally, the red lipstick drawing on the wall, pin a feather on it, you're underway. And if you ask the right kinds of questions and know how to critically reflect and generate and develop a cycle for working in production, most importantly, an authentic curiosity, absolutely burning curiosity. Who has burning curiosity in here? You better all put them both up. If you don't have a burning curiosity, burning curiosities, you're in the wrong discipline. It's the most interesting discipline in the world, bar none. I respect all disciplines. Think about this, and then I'm going to shut up. Think about this. If you can talk about religion, a film clip that you saw 2 weeks ago, data sets, and what you're going to have for lunch in the same sentence in a crypt, that's an interesting discipline. But what it means, if you don't have burning curiosities, you've got to get them. Everyone who contributes, you're all cultural agents. You are not architecture students learning the profession. You are cultural agents, change agents. And you've got to have, we can't give it to you, you've got to have burning curiosities. So this is, yeah, just curious about things.